So there's this strange, very rare thing, actually, that happens in this morning's text from the prophet Haggai. The prophet speaks a word from God to the people as a whole, but especially to the religious and political leaders of his day. On the first day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of the reign of King Darius of Persia, which puts us at August 29th, 520 BC. Roughly 2,545 years ago, minus a couple weeks from now. Why the precise date? What exactly is happening in this part of the world at this specific time that the prophet feels the need to be so specific? And what does it have to do with us here and now? We see in 538 BC, King Cyrus of Persia, having overtaken Babylonia as the great empire, the military superpower of that region of the world, the Mediterranean region, he issued a decree that those who had been exiled by Babylonia's invading armies earlier, those who had been sent away, displaced when Babylonia conquered their homelands, like the Israelites, like those to whom Haggai writes, that all of those people could return to their ancestral homelands. This was his decree. If you've been displaced by war, by violence, you can return home. Now, among other things, the dating given by Haggai means that the prophet is speaking to a group of people who had returned to the land from exile 20 years ago. So they've been here a couple decades now, spent those 2 decades rebuilding their lives, rebuilding their homes. And now the prophet has some strong words for them, and again, especially the religious and political leaders. To them, he says, you yourselves now, having come back, you live in nice, well-established homes, and yet the Lord's house lies in ruins. Consider how you have fared, he says. Take stock. What is it you really want? You have sown much and yet harvested little. You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never seem to be able to get your fill. Always need one more. You clothe yourselves, and yet no one is warm. You earn your wages only to put them in a purse with holes in it. What is it you really want? That is, you focused on putting your lives back together, on accumulating that which is necessary to live, which is good to live, and yet you're not satisfied. Each one of you has merely focused on rebuilding for yourselves. You've not brought the people together, nor are you any closer to rebuilding a society that reflects God's priorities of the common good, of love and equity. This is not a vision of Sabbath wholeness. What? Haggai provocatively asks them and us, what is it you really want? What is it you're really after? Now, the prophet Haggai is in part calling the leaders to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem that had been destroyed by war and violence. At this point, almost 100 years earlier, right? So it's been lying in ruins for a long time. He wants them, now that they've established their lives, to rebuild it. But at the same time, it's not just about building a glorious infrastructure. It's about rebuilding a common gathering space, a sacred sanctuary to bind and build up people in unity. And as we know in our Christian tradition, Jesus expands on this notion of a physical, singular temple by saying, our bodies, you are God's temple. God has chosen to dwell within you. Not down the street, not separate, apart, way out there up in the sky. God has chosen to inhabit this temple. You, the person next to you. I think Haggai is speaking to this much larger sense here, right? We cannot just focus on building up the physical world, on making a life, while neglecting our spiritual life and world. By which I don't really mean that old-time religion and just coming to church and doing things as religious authorities tell us to, going through the rote rituals, memorizing things, not just doing it because that's the way you do it or that somehow magically makes life better. It doesn't necessarily. Can't make any of those kinds of promises. But to cultivate a space that helps us move toward what it means to be truly human, what it means to be fully, feelingly alive and in touch with that which is bigger and beyond us and yet somehow binds us together. To see all of that as a sacred and necessary endeavor. The challenge is that our world, and sometimes even our religious leaders, they don't really make space for that. They don't help us to cultivate that. Our world demands more and more and more. Keep going. Don't rest, or only rest long enough to keep going. And again, sometimes the church operates this way too. But what good is it to keep going if the direction you're headed in isn't life-giving? It might ease your anxiety just to keep putting one foot in front of the next, but at some point it's worth taking some perspective. I know some of you out here are those who like to take the long route, as long as it means you get to keep going 80, rather than the shorter route and slowing down a little bit. I think we do that in life. Again, every once in a while, we need a reset, like a real reset. We need a recalibration, and if we don't make space for that, life is probably going to force it upon us at some point. And so rather than just being carried through life on the train of time, full steam ahead, once in a while we need to jump off. Jump off and reflect. We need to ask ourselves seriously with the prophet Haggai, what is it that we really want? What are we really after? What would actually satisfy? Or as one book that I read on my sabbatical this summer by a theologian at Yale Divinity School, as he put it even more pointedly, not just what do I want, but what is worth wanting? What is worth orienting your life around and toward, really seeking after? And is that what we're doing? More than an intellectual or mental exercise, the kind of disruptive pause requires a Sabbath space. It requires a container of deep time, right? Think of the video we watched. It requires you to really sink down for a moment, to come back to yourself. That kind of a reflection, that kind of a question, it calls for enough space to be present to all that it brings up within us. To reset and rebuild our lives and our world, it requires us to inhabit new rhythms. Beyond what we've been doing, it requires us to cultivate new habits in our everyday lives, because thinking will only get us so far. While that's part of it, it'll only get us so far. Underneath Paul's perennially relatable wrestling that we read in our scripture from the book, the letter to the church in Rome, right? I don't understand my own actions. I don't do the very thing that I want. Instead, I do the thing that I hate. Why do I do this thing I want to stop, but I don't seem to be able to? Underneath this anguish lies human need that needs to be tended to for each of us. Again, what drives us, even when we don't want it to? The anger and the reactivity, the fear and the withdrawal. Either puffing up our chests and making ourselves big, or shrinking ourselves so as to not be noticed and Please don't have any opinions about me. I'm just over here. Always trying to please others, to do good, do right, even at the expense of our own health. Or never taking a risk to help someone else, to go out of your way, to be inconvenienced, focusing on self-preservation over serving others in ways that actually ask something of us. I know we valorize in our society some of these over others, but all of them point to something deeper, like Paul is trying to get us to see, to notice. There is a deeper need underneath that is crying out to be met. And when we never take time to step back and slow down to give these questions space, they rule us. They drive us. When we find up in the same arguments and the same moments of chaos and exhaustion and fatigue, we end up in the same place over and over again, throwing our hands in the air saying, how are we here again? As a world, as a society, as individuals in our relationships, how are we here again? If we don't step off the train, they rule us until we give them the space that they need. And when they rule us, they tend to dehumanize us, separate us from what it means to be human, to have needs. And when they dehumanize us, we usually take that out on others. We think, well, I never rest, so why should you get to? I had to suffer, so you should have to suffer. It's a dog-eat-dog world, right? You got to look out for yourself first, or someone else is going to take advantage of you. No one's going to help you. You can't trust anyone. You're on your own. Feel relatable to anybody besides me? These things so often drive us, whether we're aware of it or not. And when we are cut off from our pain or grief, the anger simmers and we look for someone to blame. And what begins with individuals and our relationships, it metastasizes, it grows, it spreads, and it becomes they. Those people are the problem. That person is the problem. They aren't like us. We must protect us from them. If only we could get rid of them. There is no end to what this world will demand of you and what its demands will do to you, make of you or of us, if we just keep on keeping on. In order to keep leading you in this wider community and resisting these dehumanizing forces, I knew that I was getting to a place where I needed a sabbatical. I needed the spaciousness of which allowed me to step off the train and ask myself these questions, to spend that time wrestling with these for myself. And as I thought about the kind of life worth wanting, my mind went to the lives of those who had lived such lives, the kind of lives that I was like, that's what I want. They've got something that I want. How did they get there? And in particular, this summer, my mind went to the late Archbishop of South Africa, Desmond Tutu. Do any of you know that name? A few of you? It's a name that should be known. It's worth looking up. He was chosen by Nelson Mandela, the first president, of course, after the fall of apartheid in democratic South Africa. Desmond Tutu was chosen to lead what was known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You see, after the fall of apartheid, which he had been a leader against, Desmond Tutu, everyone had predicted a bloodbath. That once freed black South Africans would rise up and do to the white Afrikaners what they had done to the indigenous population. That was the fear, right? We can't let go of apartheid because it will be a bloodbath. Of course, having participated in such violence and the justification and dehumanization as normal, right? These white South Afrikaners, they couldn't imagine any alternative because that's what they would do. That's what they had been doing. And yet that never happened, largely because instead of simply moving on, as we have tried to do here in the United States with our history of genocide and land theft and enslavement and Jim Crow and so on, instead of just simplistically responding with incarceration or moving on, South Africa engaged in a process of restorative justice through its Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'll say more about this in the future, another day, about what that looked like. But in short, it was an attempt to create a deep space and container, a time to bring forth truth for the sake of healing and moving forward together honestly, rather than merely barreling on. Right? Electing Nelson Mandela wasn't enough. Being on the right side of history wasn't enough to build up what had been torn down for so long in the world. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who had already received a Nobel Peace Prize at this point, he led that heart-wrenching, painful healing process. And I've long wondered, right, like, who could do that? How could one do that? Hold that kind of space, that scale of pain and suffering? How could he continue to insist on forgiveness and yet accountability for such horrific wrongs done? How could he hold on to hope when hope seemed hopeless? How could he maintain his conviction that everyone was a beloved child of God when everyone was telling him that the fall of apartheid would lead to greater violence? And so as I spent deep time this summer with Desmond Tutu, the human, along with other saints and mystics and peacemakers that I looked to, I realized that they could only do what they did in the world, have the impact that they did, sustain it for the long run. They could only do that because, in their own words, they had a deep commitment to and practice of Sabbath. This was how they stayed human in a world that strips it away from us if we don't resist it. How they stayed open-hearted and fiercely tender, stayed resolutely convicted and hopefully committed. This was how they refused to turn others into enemies, to play the blame game or look for a scapegoat now that they had power to oppress those who had oppressed them. This was how they were renewed and sustained for the lifelong work of partnering with God to bring a new world into being. They could only work to rebuild the ruins of this destructive world in the ways that they did because they regularly took the time to step out of it, to stop. Even when the people were shouting, "But there's more to do. You're going to let this go and just step back and rest and pray and go on a retreat or a pilgrimage or a sabbatical? You're going to take a Sabbath while the world keeps burning?" But they knew that in order to be committed for the lifelong work of love and justice, they also had to let themselves be human. To inhabit another world of deep space and time where they could rest in the presence of divine love, where the focus was not about what they were doing, how good or bad they were doing it, what they were producing. It was simply about being, about reminding them that no matter what they do or how much they do, they are a beloved child of God. When Desmond Tutu went on to write children's books, of all the things that he could talk about, that was his message. You are God's dream. Because he knew how much that he had to receive that message in order to persist. In order to stay the course, he knew how much he needed to rest in that. Not because of what he does or how much he does, but simply for being. He needed that time to come face to face with his fears, with his hopes, with his desires, with the things that drive him that he wished didn't. To ask himself, what is really worth wanting, and can I stay that course? Now, that kind of space looks different for different people. For some people, it's verbal prayer. It's kneeling in a sanctuary. For others, it's journaling or week-long retreats, again, sabbaticals, pilgrimages. Some of these folks that I turned to communed with God intimately in nature, and others came to a sanctuary like this. What I found fascinating was that all of them were able to connect with this divine presence, even in a place as discombobulating and loud and annoying as an airport terminal. But none of them could have continued pouring themselves out for the life of the world if life and love were not being poured back into them in this way. And neither, I think, can we. Certainly, I know that I can't. And that meant for me this summer, I needed to get serious about making time and space in the everydayness of life to pause. I got to figure this out. Life isn't going to hand me the rest and the pauses on its own. It will ask more of me. So we together, not just as individuals, but maybe we can encourage each other and create these spaces together, support each other in resisting that constant demand to pause, to rest, to be poured into by the love that knit and continues knitting the universe together. And if we can inhabit a spacious pause, I think we each know something of what keeps us human. We know those things that feel restorative, if we're honest with ourselves. It's not always the choices that we choose to make, but we know when we are coming back to ourselves and something is life-giving. The question is, can we move from that realization to a discipline, to a habit of making space for that which heals and restores, that builds up this temple of God? That builds up this temple of God, so that we can together rebuild the temple of this world. Not one or the other, but both necessarily together. Friends, may it be so. For your healing and flourishing, for the healing and flourishing of all the world. Amen.